Hi, I'm Jess, the founder of Positive HR.
And I'm Mikey, co-host of the Leader Lab podcast, where we speak with leaders to learn about what inspires them to help you on your leadership journey.
Together, we'll explore the hearts and minds of leaders. We blend curiosity with insight as we learn firsthand what it takes to be a leader who truly inspires and drives positive change.
Join us as we dive deep into the art and science of human-centered leadership. Welcome to the Leader Lab. Shane, so good to catch up with you and to have you here on the Leader Lab podcast.
Absolute pleasure. And it's also just great to see you.
In the foyer. And it's been a big 12 months for you. Last time we spoke in person, you were heading off overseas to take the work that you do global to the UK, to Europe and to the US. So let's start, for those of you who don't know you and the work that you do, with a bit of an intro. What do you do and why do you do it?
Oh, great question. Great second question. The work that I do is I help teams to try to make sense of this weird abstract thing called culture, and then hopefully create a culture within their team that makes people want to show up to work every single day. And I think I've learned over time that if you can create a great work environment, you don't just influence people at work, you influence their whole life. We spend so much of our time at work, we actually want to enjoy the time we spend at work, so it actually bleeds back into our home life as well. So I think that's probably a bit of part of the reason why I do it as well.
Yep. I love that. I'm really excited to talk to you about this because it's an area that I've been really interested in for some time, and I've done my best to learn, and I've learned a lot from you through the work that you do and the books that you've written. One of the biggest challenges I have is defining culture. When we talk about workplace culture, we have an experience of it. Everyone who's ever been in a workplace or working from home or works in a team has an experience of the culture. What is culture?
So it's a great first question. It's kind of like a fish trying to make sense of water. And it's this thing that we spend our entire career immersed in. And probably someone's always used the phrase, I love the culture, hate the culture, we need to do something about the culture. And then you ask people to try and define it and everyone's like, I'm not so sure. We actually did this research project, and one of the first questions we asked was, is culture important? And 99% of the people told us culture is critical to the overall success of an organization. So we know people know it matters. The second question we asked was, in what ways does it influence and show up in a business? And there were all kinds of things, psychological safety, staff attraction, retention, like all the kind of fundamentals of business. And they said, yep, here's how it matters. And then we said, do you know how to define culture? And 97% said, yes, absolutely. I know how to define culture. So then we asked the most important question is, tell us how you define it. And 1 in 10 people could give us an answer to that. And there were all different kinds of answers. But as I was looking through the raw data with the researchers, I noticed this trend starting to come through, and it was a trend. The definition was something to the effect of organizational culture is the collection of values, beliefs, and assumptions that guide and inform the actions of all team members. And it was a really good definition. And I was like, it's almost a little bit too good. And there were sort of the same variations of the same thing. And I was like, if I had said, yes, I know how to define culture, and then I was asked to define it and I didn't know the answer, what's the first thing I'd do? So just out of a whim, I opened up Google and I typed into Google, define organizational and team culture. And the definition that the 1 in 10 people gave us was that definition. It was the first definition on culture. And that for me highlighted this big idea, which is that culture is really easy to describe. You could talk about it all day, but when you ask to define it, it's really, really hard. And I think the reason why it's so hard is because as it stands, there's no universal definition of culture. It is so abstract and it's almost like we're looking at a glass of water, but we're all looking at it from different sides. And all the definitions are kind of accurate, but they're looking at it in a very different way. So trying to define it becomes really, really tricky.
Awesome. That's great. So this is really helpful.
Yes.
I'm being facetious here, but as a leader or someone in a position of influence or someone who just wants to influence, impact, change the culture for the better, who has good intentions, how do we do that? How do you go about doing that?
I think the difference between a shared definition and a shared understanding, I think are slightly different. So I don't think we need a shared definition. We don't necessarily need to agree on what is the definition of culture. What we need to basically create is what's our understanding of culture here. What are we using culture for? Culture is a pragmatic tool. Like it's designed to be used in a particular way within an organization. So if we see culture as a lever, then we go, okay, well, how do we adjust culture? How do we shape culture? How do we change culture? And I don't define it, but I give 4 kind of elements of culture. And the reason why I chose elements rather than definitions is if you know the elements, they're like the levers that you pull on to be able to adjust culture. And the 4 are essentially every definition of culture in the world that exists right now refers to culture in a collective sense, meaning that there's a collective element to it. So culture always refers to a group of people. And I think that's important to know because it tells us that wherever you have a group of people, you have culture. So you don't build culture and you don't create culture. You actually adjust culture, shape culture, design culture, because it already exists wherever there's a group of people. The second is that culture is always referring to something which is unseen, meaning that there's an invisible, intangible quality to it. So typically things like your values, your beliefs, your meanings, your assumptions, you can't point to or touch, but they're influencing culture. The third is that there's an observable element to it, meaning that the unseen things show up in an observable way. And most of the time when people try to define culture, this is how they define culture. It's the collective norms in our behaviors. And really, it's just about the way we do things around here. That's usually what people are pointing to. And the last thing is that culture has a shared learning element to it, meaning that culture is learned by being around other people. So if you have cultural influences and they're strong influences, power dynamics, leadership, they're going to influence culture in a disproportionate way, and they will influence culture because people are learning from those people in your organization. So if you know those levers, you can intentionally design culture by knowing which levers to pull on.
Okay, so let's say I'm in a hypothetical situation here that I've never been in before.
A friend of a friend.
and you know, there's some awareness of culture and those levers, and there's an intention to improve it in a certain way, but there's so many influences that are out of my control. Yeah. How would you approach it? Yeah. How can somebody who wants to make a change in a culture, how do you go about doing that?
It can feel overwhelming, especially because there's 2 components of the culture in an organization. You've got your global culture, which is how people would generally describe the culture of your organization, versus your local expression of that culture, which is my team leader and the people that are around me every single day. And I think it's possible to have potentially quite an unhealthy culture at a global level, but have a healthy culture locally. And you are almost like this little oasis within the bigger picture, but it's also possible to have a really good global culture and a really toxic local culture. So I definitely don't ever downplay a person's ability to change culture from their local context. Now, can you change an organization's culture from your local context? Probably not easily, because culture is always averages, not aspirations, meaning that it's going to be the sum average of the way that we do things as an organization or as a team, not the aspiration of what we hope that we'll do things as a team. However, culture can be aspirational, meaning that it should be aspirational, which is who we want to become. But for someone in a local expression, typically I look at kind of 5 conversations that they can have with their local team or with their team leader that help shape culture by design. The first 2, I talk about expectations and clarification, which is typically about the question, what do we expect of one another on this team? And then what does that look like in observable behaviors? I've found the more teams talk about their expectations, the more they realize they have in common. And they will sit there and talk to each other and say, oh, this is what I expect of you as a leader. And they're like, oh, I expect that of my team as well. You're like, oh, I think we want the same things, but we maybe just talk about it differently. And it brings to the surface what I call the unspoken spokens, the things that we all kind of know but we never talk about. And then once they're at the surface, you find the common themes that we want as a team, and then it allows you to go really deep on the behaviors, which is, okay, so if we want this, what does this actually look like? What does this require of us as a team to be able to live this out every day? And once you've done that, you can then put language around it and you can communicate it in a way that goes, how do we want to talk about this? How do we want to embed this into our vocabulary? And therefore, we now know what to celebrate and when we see it, and we know what to challenge when we see it. So if you can start with expectations and behaviors and language, you've got a really clear pathway for celebrating the good and challenging the bad.
Yeah, I love that you've included clarification with that expectation conversation, because so often expectations are assumed and misunderstood if they're not explicitly clarified.
Yeah.
There's a quote from Esther Perel, which I've been referencing a lot recently, and it goes something like, unexpressed and unclear expectations are future resentments.
Wow.
And it really makes sense that we resent somebody's behavior, or we resent a situation because we expect it to be a certain way. And those expectations, if they're not clarified and communicated and universally understood tend to result in, a culture where people are, disappointed in the way things are, or disappointed in the way other people are working, or in outcomes. And so expectations and clarification
Hugely important. There's a quote by Toria Leto. She's a New York psychologist, and she said, "What isn't communicated is felt. What's felt is interpreted, and what's interpreted is often inaccurate." So when you think about those expectations, we hold them, and we've probably had those experiences where you have a manager and you go, "I think they sent me an email on a Saturday, and therefore I think they want me to be working on a Saturday, and therefore I don't clarify whether they want me to, and then I've misinterpreted their expectations, and now I'm working on weekends, and I'm angry at my manager because they're expecting me to work on weekends. But if I just clarified with them saying, 'Hey, I got an email from you on Saturday, just out of curiosity, do you expect me to reply to those on a weekend?' And they would probably say, 'Oh gosh, no, I'm sorry. I was just, it was in my head and I needed to get it out of my head right now.' So the clarification of expectations is so important.
Yeah. And you've written a couple of books focused on Let's Talk Culture, and your first book was
Lead the Room,
which is about communication.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing is communication is a huge part and an essential component of designing culture.
Yeah.
And not just communicating, but communicating clearly with intention, clarifying expectations and understandings.
Yeah.
Something that sort of strikes me as really obvious, but so overlooked, is the fact that we're communicating all the time, but we're not necessarily understanding what is being shared.
Yep.
And so you example of, a text message or a Teams message or something out of hours can really be misunderstood if the intention's not clarified. So communication, how do we
how do we communicate?
You got 5 minutes.
Where do we
how
start?
do we communicate better? And I love that you've shared some really practical frameworks so far. Yeah, for somebody who's leading a team perhaps for the first time, or who's in a position of leadership and authority and who's responsible for communicating well.
I think great communication is not just a transfer of words, it's an exchange of meaning. And really what we're looking for is, most of the time we're just trying to get our words across, and we forget that every word is deeply wrapped in meaning and interpretation. And so there's an ownership that is required of both the communicator and the receiver. And I always am trying to put myself in both the position of the person who's trying to get a message across, and also a person who's trying to decode and make sense of that message. And so if you are the person that's communicating, there is an ownership required to make sure that your meaning has been understood. And to do that, you sometimes just have to check in with a person. And a lot of leaders, they will often just go, "Here's what I need you to do, go away and do it." And they don't get that chance for the person to reflect back what they've heard. And a simple step that you could do is just go, "Hey, can I just double check? Can I just clarify how you have received that message, or what you heard, or could you just repeat it back to me so I make sure that what you're hearing is actually what I'm trying to say?" Especially in some of those really crucial conversations. That one additional step of making sure that the person hears what you intended them to hear by just asking the question can go a long way. There's also an ownership of the person who's listening, which is the sense that if you feel like maybe you've misinterpreted, or if there's that initial thought of like, someone makes a passing comment and it like jars you a little bit, and you go, "That hurt. They said something and it didn't quite sit right with me." More often than not, we take that away and then we sit on that, and we sit on it, and we go over it, we replay that statement, we stew on it until the time it becomes a crisis. Then you bring it back to the person, and then you're ready to fight. Whereas in that moment, there is an ownership where you just go, "Hey, can I just pause for a second? You made a comment just then, and I would love to ask for a bit of clarity behind it, because I think there's a potential that I might misunderstand what you meant. Can you explain it for me? Could you unpack that a bit more for me?" And that additional step means they go, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that." There's this great principle. Occam's razor is like the most simplest explanation is usually the correct one. There's another phrase called Hanlon's razor, which is this phrase, "Don't attribute to malice that which could be adequately described through carelessness." And more often than not, most leaders that I talk to, they're not being malicious, they're being careless. They say something and they don't mean it to be malicious or come across in a wrong way. They were just careless with their words. And I think we as a leader have to own the responsibility of that. But sometimes when we're listening, we go, "Oh, they were careless, but I'm now going to sit on that." But if I ask the clarifying questions, we can diffuse things a whole lot earlier than they need to before they blow up.
I'm trying to make something, or trying to direct this conversation about something that's very complex, communication and culture.
Yeah.
Complex by definition, because as you said, it's a collective experience. It's unseen, and there's a shared learning element to it. It feels, if we come back to culture, it feels like there's so many variables involved. Whose responsibility is it then? And is it a person's responsibility to direct or to sort of drive or to design a culture? Because it sounds like if that's not happening, then it happens by default and it becomes the sum of the, parts, which might not necessarily be the kind of culture or outcome that you desire. So is it someone's responsibility? Whose responsibility is it? And why aren't they doing something about it?
Yeah. Well, I think everything, I mean, the old quote that everything rises and falls on leadership. I think leaders play a disproportionate responsibility in culture design, because ultimately at the end of the day, they have to create the environment that people want to show up and work within. And there's also a responsibility for people to align to a culture that may not necessarily be the culture that they would design. So that's a challenge as well, because I always look at culture as in terms of the spectrum. It's not right or wrong. It's just two very different ways about going something. So for example, you might have a manager who they're a massive micromanager. They jump into the detail. They love getting into the detail. Now, maybe not to the extent of full micromanagement, but they love being in the detail of things. You might have another manager who's completely hands-off. They don't want any of the detail. And so which one of those is accurate? Well, it doesn't really bother me which one is right. What matters to me is what is the team that they want to create, and are those team members aware of that, and can they opt in or opt out of that? A good example of this, someone said to me recently, I would never work in a toxic culture like Tesla. Or I would never work for a toxic leader like Elon Musk. I'm like, maybe you wouldn't, and I probably wouldn't either, but there's a lot of people who would, because there is explicit communication about the kind of leader that he is and the kind of culture that he's created. One thing that you can't fault him for is he's always been really explicit about what he expects of his people. And people opt into that. And so we would look at it as toxic, and we would look at some of the cultural things as unhealthy, but in their context, it's healthy for them, and it's part of their expectations. So it's a really hard line to manage, but the main thing is have we made it explicit? And the only person who can make that explicit is the leader of the team. And so there is a disproportionate responsibility on them to make that.
What happens then when you've got a situation where a leader has made aspirational or the desired culture explicit, but the implicit behaviors or the behaviors that they default to, that they demonstrate, contradict what it is that they've said that they want. When there's that gap between here's the culture that we want and here's what we expect of everybody and here's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Because that can happen,
right?
It
happens all the time. I mean, especially if culture is aspirational. The amount of times I work with teams and we design their culture and everyone looks at the culture and goes, that's not us. I'm like, that's okay. But we can become more like that. And we have to make it really explicit about where are we now on that journey and where are we working towards. There's a difference between someone not living up to the culture but trying and working towards an aspirational culture versus a person who disregards the aspiration and is all talk and no action. And I think we can often tell the difference between someone who makes a mistake and doesn't live up to the culture and owns it versus someone who is explicitly and intentionally just doing what they want and pushing the culture to the side. And I will say on this, leaders, so everyone says, who has the biggest influence on culture? And the truth is we all have to have an influence on culture, because if our team doesn't want the culture, we won't create it. One leader cannot create a culture. 12 executives at the top of an organization of 500 people will not create the culture. They can't. There's just too small a number of people. It needs everyone's buy-in. However, they do have disproportionate influence. So if you've got 12 people at the top of the organization who don't live the culture, it will have a disproportionate influence on the organization. So in one way, they can influence the organization.
So good. Really appreciate, again, taking what is quite a complicated and complex issue of culture design and breaking it down into some steps for us. For somebody who's listening, who's really interested in being a bit more intentional and who is perhaps in a position of influence, where would they start? you mentioned having a culture to aspire to, also acknowledging where you are. If you were to advise somebody on, what they could do now and over the next, sort of few months to begin to shift the culture, where would you start?
Yeah, I'd always just start with expectations. I think we hold expectations of the world. So they usually set of 3 expectations we hold. The first is expectations of ourselves. So what do I expect of myself to be? So I want to be this by this certain age. I want to have this by a certain stage of life. I should be this kind of leader. We hold expectations of ourselves. We have expectations of others, so who people should be and how they should interact with us. We also hold expectations of the world in general, like what kind of place the world should be. So when we say, people should just be kind, that's an expectation we hold of the world. Not everyone holds that expectation. I call it like your invisible rule book. It's this invisible rule book you hold. And the problem with the invisible rule book is we use it to judge ourselves and everyone else by, but no one else can see it. So when someone, I use this as a good example, when someone comes in and they go, Mikey, do you mind doing this for me? And you go, yeah, I'll do it. And I actually really need this by tomorrow. Like, yeah, of course, I'm happy to deliver that. Yeah, no worries at all. We catch up tomorrow and I go, hey, Mikey, did you do that thing? You're like, oh, sorry, I got really busy. Had some other stuff come up that was more important. In your mind, you might hold the worldview that I will do it as long as there's nothing more important that comes up, and something more important came up. So therefore, that's less important. Therefore, it gets pushed to the back burner. Whereas for me, I hold this worldview is that you said yes to me and then didn't deliver on that. And so I walk away absolutely fuming, and you walk away and don't think about it at all. Or vice versa. And you sit there and you go, well, hang on a minute, what's that? That's an expectation of others that you hold. It's just that people, if they say yes, they'll follow through on their commitments. And some of the things that are most natural to us as a set of expectations, we just assume the world holds, but they don't. But the moment you and I sit down and have a conversation, I say to you, hey, just so you know, one of my expectations of people that work with me is if they say yes, they will deliver on that and they'll follow through on their commitments. And sometimes if that means you can't do it, you'll come back to me and let me know. You won't just not deliver. So once we have that conversation, you might say, well, actually, I have a very different expectation of that. So now you and I have to decide what we do, which is, do you as a team member just align to my way of working? Do I as a team leader adjust my expectations of you and meet in the middle? But that creates a really robust and helpful conversation, because once you've had that conversation moving forward, we now have a bit of a guiding frame for us to be able to have conversations.
I'm laughing because it sounds a lot like, my day yesterday with the difference between expectations and reality, not necessarily in a work context. I aspire to meet the expectations that I have and that I set, but reality sometimes doesn't really care so much about our expectations for how things are.
Yeah,
and I think the economic, political, the global, cultural, socio-political environment in which companies and teams and leaders and people are living and working now is very uncertain. And so I'm wondering the impact that has. You talked about sort of global and local cultures. How much does what's happening in the world impact the experience people are having at work in their workplace cultures?
I mean, there used to be this kind of belief that you leave your home at home and your work is work, and those two worlds don't cross over. You can't have that in a team culture, and you can't have that at work anymore. Like, if you're behind on your mortgage and you can't pay your bills and you're basically looking down the barrel of losing your home, you don't just rock up to work and be like, hey, I'm ready to go. I'm pumped. I'm going to give my best today.
Ready for the fruit bowl, loving the yoga.
Do you know what I mean? Like you can't divide those two worlds anymore. And so as leaders, I talk to people a lot, and they're struggling at the moment because they're playing the role of both leader, counselor, coach, and they're putting all these hats on at work to try and navigate the world with their teams. And so it's a really tricky place for a leader to be. So it influences the way people show up, and the way people show up will ultimately impact the culture of your team.
Love that. I want to dig in on this a little bit, because I think there's something that you've mentioned which is really important. The role of leader now, and arguably always has been, but now there's a lot of factors that are bringing this to the fore. The role of leader being not just somebody who manages a process, who is leading a team who are delivering work, but it's people. And it always has been people. And culture is, a group of people who are doing things in a certain way, but ultimately you're working with and leading and have some responsibility for people and their experience. how has the role of a leader changed over time, and how important is that ability to understand and care for people? You mentioned, the role of a coach, counselor, etc. Some leaders are like, hey, that's not my role, but it's hard to avoid the fact that you're dealing with people who are having a very human experience, which, as I said before, at this time is, it's uncertain, and that brings a lot of fear, etc. So, some added expectations on the role of a leader, which may not be explicit.
Yeah, it's definitely not in your PD. No one's writing in your PD helping a person navigate a breakdown in a marriage or helping a team member balance work and life after returning to the workforce after having a child. Like, no one's writing that in your PD, and yet leaders are having to manage those huge life transitions and moments for people. And so much of our life is spent at work. And so we carry a lot of the stuff that's happened outside of work into our work experience. How's the role of leadership changed over the years? I mean, I'm still quite young. I feel like I can't speak hugely to it, but I can recount an experience I had being a new leader with someone who was quite a seasoned and mature leader. And I will never forget it. They basically talked to me. They said, Shane, you have to maintain the leadership gap. And I was like, what's the leadership gap? And they said the gap between how close people can get to you. Because as a leader, you need to be seen in a particular way. You don't want to be making friends with people on your team. You need to maintain the leadership gap. It was really, really early days I've heard that. And that's one thing I think is a huge shift in what people expect of leaders, is they don't want a leader who is disconnected, absent. They want a leader who is close, relational, coach, investor. And that is a huge shift, because you basically got, you kind of boomers who are in positions of leadership now, very senior positions of leadership. You've got millennials who were mentored by those boomers who were trying to lead Gen Z in a way that was mentored by boomers. So we're trying to figure out how to lead Gen Z, who have a very different set of expectations based on the model of leadership that we saw from boomers, which is completely the opposite of what Gen Z want. So I feel really sorry for millennials kind of stuck in this sandwich between kind of those generations going, I've got to relearn leadership here, because these people want a coach and they want someone who's invested in their life. The issues that we've got now are not about the leadership gap, it's about the leadership blur, which is how do we navigate the line between my role as a leader versus someone who wants a friend? And that's a really tricky, complex space to navigate.
Yes, it is.
And this is why I think, coming back to the expectation conversation, is if you've got a team of Gen Z team members, the simple question to ask is, hey, what do you expect of me as a leader? And they will tell you if you ask them. Most people say, how do we deal with the issues and the complexities of people? How do we create better engagement? How do we create better culture? How do we create better programs? And my answer is simple. Ask your people. They will tell you if you ask them, but they will stop telling you if you don't action what they tell you. And there's a key distinction in that. People will tell you what they think, and if you listen and you do something with it, they'll keep telling you what they think. If they tell you what they think and you do nothing with it, they will stop telling you. And that'll make it really, really hard to try and implement things that are helpful for people.
Oh, that's super helpful. And I love, keep coming back to this expectation conversation. It's so helpful. And it's a really good place to start. So thank you for taking what is quite a complicated concept and distilling it somewhat. Something I'd really like to touch on just briefly before we wrap up is self-awareness and understanding. You talk about, culture and global culture and a local culture. If we distill it even further, an individual with our own beliefs and our own values and our own expectations and our own behaviors and ways of working, we are a culture within ourselves. So how do we leverage some self-awareness? And I know you've done a lot of work around understanding and bringing strengths into the work that you do. How might an individual who's in a position of responsibility, a leader perhaps, understand themselves and their strengths and leverage those? Because I feel like it's a huge opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, you and I have a mutual friend, Rowan Dredge, who often uses this phrase of learning what it looks like to be on the other side of your leadership, or looking at what it looks like to be on the other side of you. And a lot of that self-awareness piece is a huge component of knowing who I am and how I'm wired ultimately determines how I show up into my work, how I lead my team, how all those things that play out. Someone asked me recently, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. She said, Shane, do you think it's possible to teach self-awareness? And that question stumped me. I don't know what your thoughts are on it. Do you think it's possible for people to learn self-awareness, or is it just something you do?
In my experience, it is something that you do, and I need somebody to guide me to that and through that process. And that's for me been a combination of learning. In the last 24 hours, for example, I've listened to a podcast that's given me a conceptual framework, and I've also worked with a therapist who's guided me through a very internal, reflective process, which I would also practice in my own time by myself. But I feel like there's a need to be guided through a process, and then also to take the responsibility to learn. So yes, I think you can learn it.
Yeah.
You can learn how to, but you have to experience that, and then bring that experience into practice and into relationships, and then it's an ongoing practice of self-reflection. And a lot of that learning is reflected back through the quality and the nature of the relationships you're having, whether that be in work and how effective they are in meeting those expectations that you've said are so important.
You kind of need someone or something to hold a mirror up to you for self-reflection, right? Or self-awareness. Because like you can't just sit here and go, I look like this. I need a mirror to look into to actually see, if I got food in my teeth, if I got something going on. And that I think sometimes can be a person. I think most of the time it is a person. And it's usually, sometimes it's your team. They'll hold a mirror up to you very quickly. Other times it's like a tool or an assessment. So I do a lot with Clifton Strengths, and I use Gallup's Clifton Strengths because it's a mirror for a person to see what they do well and how they can leverage what they do well to tackle some of their biggest challenges and obstacles. But I think I'm all for get a therapist, get a coach, get other people who can hold mirrors up for you and give you a framework, and give you your own handheld mirror so that you can carry it around. Like maybe it's a framework or a tool or a reflective practice, and every single day you're just using that tool, but it's kind of elevating your self-awareness. I think self-aware leaders are just the most impactful leaders.
Yeah, I think the mirror analogy is really, really valuable. And when it comes to strengths, asking for feedback on the impact that you have is really valuable. Something that I've found when it comes to strengths is, I might have my own interpretation or understanding of my strengths, but how others experience that through the work that I do and their reflection of that is often quite surprising. To ask somebody, well, what do you consider most valuable in the way in which I work? What would you consider to be a strength?
Yeah.
When have I been most impactful or most helpful or most, detrimental? When am I at my best? And to understand what that experience is like for others is also really, really valuable reflection and feedback.
Yeah.
There's that saying, you can't, read the label from inside the box. And so to have that reflected back to you, the impact of the way in which you work and what those strengths might be, as well as an assessment tool, which I think is really helpful.
Super helpful.
Is a great strategy. And that's, self-reflection is not only, looking within, but it's also asking for, feedback and taking that on board and taking some responsibility for what's working and what's not.
Yeah, I think the most fundamental skill, I think, for any leader is that a leader can be a learner. I think like if you can maintain that posture of a learner, learning about yourself, learning about your team, learning about the people around you. I have like a kind of, so it's kind of a weird acronym that I use for the phrase learn, but I always kind of have these mantras around the word learn, which is to listen like your life depends on it. I think about if you're about to jump out of a plane attached to someone in a parachute and they're giving you instructions, listen like your life depends on it. So every context that you're in, every leader you're around, listen like your life depends on it. You'll get so much out of it. The second thing is to experience the world like you only get to live it once. So imagine if you only had the opportunity to experience tasting coffee just once in your lifetime. How would that shape how you tasted coffee? So maybe you're in an exec team meeting, experience it like you only ever get one exec team meeting to listen and to learn and to experience that. The third is to ask questions until people get annoyed with you. So just keep that curious mindset and nature. The third is to read like you're about to be tested. So everything you read it like you're about to apply it and implement it and practice it. And the last thing is to network like a crisis might come tomorrow, because you never know when you might need to draw on a network of people to support you and to build that kind of crew around you. And for me, that's just this constant state of learn.
That's awesome. Thank you, Sam. I'll be going straight back to listen to this and take down notes around that LEARN acronym. That's really powerful.
Thank you, mate. I appreciate it.
For that and for everything else that you've shared in this conversation, for the work that you do with your speaking, with your workshops, with your books, and I've been privy to experiencing and witnessing all of those. I've been in workshops that you've run in a workplace, heard you speak, read your books, and your ability to take something really sometimes vague, ambiguous, complex and complicated and make it human and relevant and understandable it's a real gift, and you're having a really significant impact on people who are wanting to do good work. So for that and for all the work that you do, thank you very much. It's been a
really
absolute
kind,
pleasure.
Mikey. Thank you so much. It's honestly, I love any chance we get to have a conversation together on a microphone or off. It's always a privilege.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much, mate.
Thanks for joining us in the Leader Lab. We hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as we did bringing it to you.
We have plenty of inspiring leaders and their stories to share. Ensure you don't miss these episodes by subscribing wherever you're listening to this. Links to today's guest are in the show notes, and you can find links to our socials there too.